This is another iRaw podcast.
Welcome back to Season 6 of the Animal Highlights, where we're focused in on animals and museum objects / museum collections. Throughout this season, Rosa Dyer has taken us on an incredible journey of thinking about how animals are represented in specific objects that you find in museums, to thinking about animals who live in museums, to thinking about what other kinds of spaces could be considered more than human museums, like zoos. She raised a host of questions, everything from the ways in which Indigenous practices are represented in museums, to thinking about what role beauty plays in the gathering and the collecting and the making of specific objects, to thinking about how these objects bring different animals together, both in how these different animals are represented, but also in how specific animals' bodies, thinking here of the poison dart frog, are used to enhance the features of other animals who will inevitably and later be used in specific museum objects. I had so much fun working with Rosa over the course of this. It's always great when you get to sit and focus with someone on specific concepts and ideas and really think deeply about how can we know and represent and talk about animals in interesting ways. And we continue those conversations a bit here today. We're going to finish her season off with a bit of a review. It's a discussion. Rosa joins us again. As a reminder, Rosa is a collective doctoral project PhD candidate at Birkbeck College, University of London, and the Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford. Her practice-based project at the Pitt Rivers Museum focuses on featherwork collections made by South American Indigenous peoples, and her work aims to reveal the dynamic relations that exist between birds, people, and environments by working with Indigenous collaborators to reimagine how the feathered objects are represented in the museum. Herre de Bondt and Rebecca Shen join me on the show once again to also talk about the season and the lessons that they learned over the course of the season, some of the questions that arose for them. As a reminder, if you haven't heard Herre or Rebecca on the show, you should definitely go and listen to Herre's season on animals and waste. It's fascinating, really, really fascinating and interesting. And Rebecca Shen, she does all of the design work for us. She's done all of the posters for the Animal Highlights. She helped me to rework the parts of the website. Her designs are beautiful. They feature on a great deal of our merch. And Rebecca is also a designer, and she's done quite a bit of work on developing scripts that focus on animals and design, but that will be forthcoming in the future. We're still working our way through that and taking our time doing it, which I think is totally fine. But you can find out more about both Herre and Rebecca, as well as Rosa, on our website. Head over, click team, and find out some of what they do. I don't want to keep you too much longer because this is a longer episode today. We're going to clock almost an hour, but it's a really interesting conversation. And if you've listened to the episodes, I think it ties and raises a whole bunch of questions that I'm sure you had yourself. So thank you for joining me this season. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have a spot of time, please remember to leave a review wherever you listen. The Animal Highlights is a spin-off podcast of the Animal Turn podcast. If you want to dive more into bigger concepts and deeper philosophy, head over to the Animal Turn and check that out too. But for now, happy listening. Hello. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight. Rosa, Herre, and Rebecca. All of you have been on the show before, so it's great to have you back. Herre, your waste season is doing very well on the airwaves. Rebecca, your sketches are garnering loads of attention. And Rosa, I am so excited that people have had a chance to listen to everything you've said about museum collections and objects and animals this season. So we're recording this before they've all been released. And, I was thinking before this episode, the goal of which is to kind of do a review of your season. I was like, what are we calling your season? I know that we've played around with it a whole bunch. We've been like museum collections, museum artifacts, objects, historical objects, feathered objects. We've really run around. But I think in general, your season is focused on museum objects, right? Or archived objects.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I think I'd originally gone into it as animals and museums, but actually I think one of the things that emerged very quickly was that the animal objects very quickly escape the museum when you try and talk about them, that it's often not talking about the objects necessarily in situ, but kind of using them as a starting point to try and explore their lives before or after or around when they were in the museum, which has been at least what I find the most interesting there.
Yeah, it's been marvelous kind of using a starting point to then think about animals who I think almost all of your animals haven't appeared on the animal highlight before. So it's been marvelous kind of learning about the histories of various animals and also thinking about the implications for them in today's world. So today, Rosa, you and I are joined, Hera and Rebecca are going to join us, and we're going to think about some of the key themes and topics to emerge over the course of your season, your 7-part season. So I'm going to open it up. Hera, Rebecca, the guests already know you, so I'm going to just skip that part where we get to know you. Sorry, you're going to have to go back and find out about them. And we're just going to jump straight in. So let's go. What for you were the key themes to emerge from this season?
Rosa, I really enjoyed listening to your season. In particular, I never really thought about animals in museums quite often, but it does, it intersects a lot of interests that, I looked into myself. For example, there's a lot of ethical questions with animals in museums. There's a lot of issues of like whether animals should be used as fashion, and then, how animals end up in these museums. And then there's the indigenous cultures aspect. So very interesting season that intersects a lot of these topics. One theme that really stuck out to me was the ethics, of course, because as an animal rights activist, you discuss a lot, or I was thinking a lot about how you know the violence that you discussed with the animals, and both in their hunting, but also their how they've been extracted through science and end up in these museum spaces. I guess I would like to know what your personal experience is in you being within these museum spaces and how you, I guess, address these tensions with the ethics of having these animals as specimens and objects in museums.
Yeah, I think like that's a really central point to what came up over and over again was this link between extractivism and collecting and what that means for an animal then to exist in a museum. I think you're right. Like I was quite careful, I suppose, in trying to keep it complex over the series. So I think probably in particularly in the Huya episode, in the hummingbird episode, and then in the Mudeng and talking about Edwin Rist and the kind of big feather heist, I think the issue of ethics and collecting comes up in different ways. Like I think when we're talking about kind of historical collecting practices where the birds were taken out of their natural environment in order to specifically be part of collections and were kind of objectified in this very extractivist way that really related to these processes of colonialism and extraction where, people from a Western or kind of Euro-American point of view would say, well, this is kind of a blank slate place, New Zealand or Latin America that we can extract whatever we like from and bring it back to Europe. And, that's our right to do so. I think that was one process. And then with Mudeng, you have something slightly different where you have a living animal in that space. And that's something very different, I think, to when you're bringing a dead body into the museum. So I think it was a really complex issue. The one that I think, and for me personally, where I've kind of had to encounter it much more directly, I mean, I've never been involved in kind of collecting in the field in terms of bringing my research is mostly to do with birds. So I've never done bird skin collection. It is still done. So my main experience of it is actually within the museum, seeing scientific collections and working on them in that way. And I think I mentioned it in the episode, but a kind of moment that really struck me is I was in the Department of Birds in the Smithsonian doing forensic ornithology. So I was trying to identify bird feathers from dead bird skins. And I opened a drawer of African greys, African grey parrots, and my mum has got a pet African grey parrot. And the just real moment of seeing, what was a whole tray of my mum's parrot is called Gus, and seeing just a whole tray of Gus's just sat there was a real kind of, I think I'd had quite a level of detachment from that. And I think particularly because when I'm looking at the objects, I'm often looking at them in quite kind of fragmented perspectives because I'm looking at individual feathers a lot of the time. So it's quite easy actually to lose perspective of the whole body and therefore the whole life of the bird. And I think that was a real moment for me of going, oh gosh, actually it is very morgue-like and very much kind of, almost a cemetery of these animals who, as I talk about in the Edwin Rist episode, like, do you have really important value still for science and I think are worth having. And it's not as if like Edwin Rist kind of perspective of it when he stole all those bird skins was to say, well, they have no value anymore. Like, I might as well use them for my fly fishing because they have no value to science. And I think that is wrong. They do continue to have value for science, but yeah, it is extremely ethically complex and something that, yeah, personally can be very emotional particularly when you then explore the lives of those birds in the wild, which is something I kind of wanted to do in the series.
I mean, I have to say, I really appreciated kind of your ethical ambiguity to some extent. Like sometimes we can say this is right and this is wrong, but that becomes, in fact, actually much harder when you start to look at historical stories because ideas of what are right and wrong change over time. But also, I think you did a lot of ethical probing and left us as listeners with an opportunity to think about, as you say, this kind of extractivism and the extractive logics that often are found in archives and museum collections, and not just with regards to the animals involved, but also with regards to the indigenous communities. And there was one of the episodes where you said, we have to avoid this idea of the noble savage, right? Like, so there's often this kind of really simplistic narrative of colonizers come in, they take the animals, they extract them in really violent means, and those animals continue to be consumed in places like museums and through science, right? Without seeing, as you say, without actually seeing the animals. You see the feather, you see the science, but you don't really see the animal. And I think that's a common problem in animal studies generally, or not animal studies, but in scholarship that considers animals. Um, but I really appreciated how you created these kinds of ethical openings for thinking about how different communities engage in different practices that could be ethically challenging. And the one that stood out for me was I'm going to say it wrong, the tapirage?
The tapirage. Yeah, definitely.
Tapirage, that kind of keeping animals alive to pluck their feathers and change the colors. And that just seemed so physical, right? And personal and problematic, but also a practice that's gone now and no longer practiced. So it's definitely complex, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think I quite like kind of the thread that we managed to do between the Huya episode, the hummingbird episode, and the parrot episode, where I think in all three I talk about kind of Western perspectives on it, but then also indigenous science and indigenous kind of ways of viewing the animals, but also how they kind of would be treated within those communities. Because as you say, it's not a clear thing. I think I talk about it in terms of violent care, particularly with the parrots who would look after and raise them as part of their community and, really take care of them. And they were part of the family. But within that, they were part of the social contract. And that meant also giving something which, probably involved pain and involves kind of a level of, violence in the plucking of the feathers. And yeah, I think, it's a big part of my kind of general doctoral research as well as for this series of making sure that when we're talking about, the involvement of humans, when we think of, animals as objects or animals as, beings that we understand, that the kind of idea of Western science or academic science is not the only way for us to discuss this, that actually when you involve, thinking about stuff like indigenous mythology or even indigenous perspectives to conservation, like in the Here episode, that those are also very valid and very important things to consider when we think about ethics, that kind of Euro-American or academic ethics is not the only way which we can kind of think about these complexities. And they remain complex. It's not, as you say, it's not the noble savage thing of, indigenous people never do harm or never cause violence or never cause pain to animals or never have complex relationships with animals. I think complexity is universal, but I think involving those perspectives is very important.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of kind of contrasting the different views and also how I think, particularly at the hummingbird episode, how those views can change, how like the movement of the animal slash object changes. I thought it was quite interesting how you spoke about the hummingbird as being feisty, and then you said somewhere in the Atlantic it lost that feistiness and became pretty. And I thought that was quite a powerful. Um, while there are ethical challenges in different groups of people, where those challenges lie are also different, and how much Western rhetoric and ideas were shaped by the spectacle and the beauty and the exotic was really quite pronounced. Harry, do you have any thoughts here with the theme of ethics?
Yeah, plenty of thoughts. First of all, I thought this season was really cool. And Rosa, I think you have a really nice, enthusiastic way of telling about things. Like it almost made me draft an email to Claudia being like, hey, can I do another season? Just by the sheer passion you have for this, which was really cool to listen to. And there were a few themes, and I think the ethics one was really interesting. And it also makes me think about the role of museums a lot. And I was wondering whether this, or maybe you work at the Pitt Rivers Museum in general, whether this made you reflect on the role of museums nowadays, whether they're for education, conservation, what they do, because a lot of your episodes were about objects that really aren't even, they're like completely different from what they are when they're not in a museum. It's crazy how there's completely different worlds outside of the walls of a museum for the same object. So do you reflect do you have any reflections on museums?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is kind of the world I operate in usually. And I think I've talked to Claudia a lot about this, that the really nice thing about doing this series has been that it's really made me focus in on the animal perspective, because, I am coming in from a multi-species perspective when I'm looking at objects, when I'm, my focus is on featherworks generally. And I am like quite specifically looking at the birds, but I'm also looking at the people. I'm also looking at the archive. I'm looking at, how they're positioned in the museum. And I think, part of it's a practice-based project, so it's not just about writing a thesis, but it's also about producing practice in the museum, which for me, a lot of that has been to do with public engagement and education. So trying to understand and, communicate stories about the objects to the general public, to, open the objects up to people. And I think what's been really nice about doing this series is that it's really made me, in quite a kind of, almost blinkered way, think, okay, keep the animal at the center here, because it's quite easy to go off into, well, this is the human perspective, or this is the person that made it, which are all very interesting and like valid points. But I think keeping the animal body and the kind of lived animal has been really helpful. And actually, I had like really interesting responses from people when I've been in the museum, when I've kind of refocused in on that. Because I think, interestingly, what I get in the museum when I ask people about the featherwork displays that I work on is I usually get one of two responses. I get, oh gosh, those poor birds, or I get, oh my God, they're so pretty. And like one's an aesthetic response to do with the objects as decoration or as kind of bodily adornment on people's, I think is quite separate from the lived animals that the objects are made from. And the other one is an acknowledgement that they do come from animals, and there is a process of death and a process that makes people slightly uncomfortable when they look at them. And it's interesting, like when I've been doing surveys, I usually get about a 50-50 response for that. And I've like, that's kind of almost been one of the central things of my thesis when I've been writing them, was like, how do you reconcile this, complex ethical feeling about particularly having animal bodies and animal materials in a museum space versus what are inherently beautiful and inherently, amazing pieces of craftsmanship a lot of the time that do have very human stories to them.
Do you find in these interactions that when you didn't center the animals, so let's say you just focused on the headdress and you were like, this headdress is made of so many feathers and came from this area, and, but you didn't really center the animals in their lives, did that sway that kind of 50-50? Did you see that 50-50 emerge more when you centered the animal, or in general, people seem to have a sensitivity to saying, like connecting the objects to the fact that there was a live animal prior to the object?
So interestingly, it tended to be 50. Like I try to go in cold and not influence people. So I tend to ask them, what do you think? Like before saying my whole spiel about what I do or giving them any information, I asked them what they think about the displays. And even then it was still 50-50. But one of the really interesting things, I mean, it's kind of difficult to describe in audio, but the Pitt Rivers Museum is actually right next to the Oxford Natural History Museum, and you have to walk through the Natural History Museum to get to the Pitt Rivers. So people are almost primed, I think, to think about the animal as they come through to the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is an ethnographic museum. It has, like, there are cabinets full of saddles, there are cabinets full of spoons. It's very kind of human-centric in many ways. And kind of one of the experiments I've been doing when I give tours through the museum is I make people go into the Natural History Museum first and stand in front of this cabinet, which is a cabinet of taxidermy, quite bad taxidermy. And like a lot of the names are wrong. It's very moth-eaten, like all the colors are very faded, but it's a taxidermy of South American birds. And there's a toucan, there's a cock of a rock, there's various parrot species and hummingbirds. And I ask them to look at that first. And then I take them up to the featherwork displays, which have all the same birds, but just in a different form, in the form of headdresses and, anklets and necklaces and stuff. And I think that's been a really interesting way to not only get people to think about like the bird connection between the objects, but also think about the different forms of collecting and different forms of how, it's still animal materials. It's the same feathers, the same species, but they're presented in very different ways in the two museums. And I think that kind of making people kind of physically move through the space has been was a real kind of key moment in unlocking that, almost kind of conversation about what is almost kind of the framing device of the museum space. Of, one is very much the framing of Western science and Western natural history. And I think the pit rivers and museums like it almost have a bit more of a kind of open-ended question mark to it, because obviously like anthropology and anthropology museums are hugely problematic. The pit rivers particularly so. And, during a lot of the Black Lives Matter campaigning, I think the Pit Rivers was called the most violent place in Oxford at one point. Like it has a huge, hugely difficult and problematic ethical kind of miasma around it that anyone who works there really has to deal with carefully. But I think I've been kind of trying to take it positively to do it in a kind of more open way of thinking about opportunity and what kind of thinking about stuff like Indigenous science, for example, or centering the bird does to allow conversations beyond what a taxidermy specimen in a natural history museum allows us to do. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, Harry, but I hope that...
It is important. I think it's easy perhaps to focus on the violence, and we should focus and talk about the violence. I think it's also easy to not acknowledge the fact that these animals were once alive and oftentimes met violent ends, right? But I think it's, they exist now within this museum space, and it becomes a question of narrative and representation. What work is their existence as objects currently doing? And if it's not doing anything to raise questions about the problematics of collecting animals, because I mean, animals are still, like you said in the mooding episode, it's easy to think that they are not still collected for these purposes, but zoos in many ways function as living collections, living examples of some of the problematics of these kinds of processes of collection. But I think it's really interesting, and you're perhaps in a space when you're dealing with museum goers to really be quite subversive, to meet people where they're at and perhaps challenge them and get them to imagine and think in ways that are perhaps not as politicized as like a zoo. Do you know what I mean?
I was thinking it would be so cool to have an audio tour through the Pit Rivers Museum where you just tell about the birds or the animals behind the objects that the objects consist of, with basically just these podcast episodes, but in an audio tour version in the museum. That'd be so cool.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I think we had talked about trying to do a bit of a collaboration with the Pit Rivers that maybe, bit of a spoiler for something later, hopefully, maybe with some video as well, because I think, I mean, it's very difficult to explain the Pit Rivers as a space because it's a lot of people kind of describe it as a museum of a museum, in that its cabinets are extremely Victorian and it's very maximalist in its display. Everything is absolutely crammed in. So like the further displays I work on, there's like 100 objects in a single space. So, and they describe it as a democracy of things approach, which I think is a bit, you can go back and forth about whether you like that phrase or not. I definitely do. But I think it does allow you, I mean, and I kind of in my, quite kind of airy-fairy thesis writing way, call it a kind of like metonymic, like fantasy aviary. It's the only place that you're going to see a toucan next to, like Scottish storm petrel next to a hummingbird. Like you'd never see these birds next to each other in real life. But in the Pit Rivers Museum, you can, through their kind of plumage being placed next to each other. And what that does to how you think about kind of avian diversity, I think, can be really interesting. So yeah, no, I'd definitely be keen.
Rebecca, what do you think here, though? Because I'm coming back to your question about ethics, and I think there is something important to think through about this, like visual consumption of animals. Like, do you think that these are connected? In you asked about ethics, and what are your views on kind of having museums as these spaces that have dead animals in effect on display? To, I guess, they make money, they also do education, but in many ways this is again the same discourse that's used with zoos. And I know I would actively not go to a zoo, right? I don't go to zoos because I don't want to engage in the kind of use of animals for these purposes, but I would go to a natural history museum. So that's an interesting disconnect, and I want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really tricky question because I actually went to a natural history museum in Paris recently, and I was, I went with the mindset of, oh, I'm so excited to learn more about animals. And that's oftentimes the reason why people also go to zoos, right? So when I went and then saw all these skins of animals on display and the taxidermy animals, there was part of me that almost just kind of wrote it off as like, oh, I wish that I dug into, why or how these collections came to be here, and where the animals, or how were the animals brought here. And, I was like, do I even know if there was, if these animals were dead already before coming to the museum? And then, you know, making myself feel better, I've learned that a lot of them are, most of them are dead already, or used for other purposes before being brought into the museum space. So yeah, these ethical questions are, always, even, people, I guess, maybe just we go to the museums like the Natural History Museum and don't necessarily think about that. But what I loved about your season, Rosa, was you did probe those questions, as Claudia said, and we tend to think of museums as, neutral spaces that is just to share scientific knowledge. But when we bring narrative telling and storytelling to that, which, inevitably are supposed to evoke emotion, and they're charged with emotion inherently. So, especially, Claudia and I, our papers about speculation. I was, I think, Rosa, what you did in your episodes was really, in part speculate on how the animals felt during some of those processes of extraction, in order to make it to their final destination, the museum. But back to your question about the, I guess, the viewing of these objects. I think another major theme was desire and beauty, and how we, perceive nature through that lens. And, across these episodes, beauty was a theme. And I took a look at the objects that you were discussing, and they are undeniably beautiful, and that's why violent practices also happen out of it. So beauty both inspires awe and then drives the destruction of animals and species. It's like, how should museums navigate that tension between aesthetic appreciation and then the histories of damage that brought this beauty to us, to the viewers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question definitely like too big for me as an individual PhD student. But I think maybe like from the particular lens of like what I've been looking at, and kind of, I think it came up a few times, particularly in the Dodo episode, actually, that, one of maybe the justifications for museums, or even to an extent zoos, although I think that's slightly different, is that they're places of conservation or preservation. That's where we're keeping objects safe. That's where, we can preserve these beautiful things and it stops them from decay. But actually, you found in the Dodo episode that so wasn't the case, that the Oxford Dodo used to be a full specimen and now only is like a head and a foot. And actually, you can't stop these processes of change and decay. And, museums are inherently visual. You really cut out quite a lot of your sensory experience of the object, and of, if you're talking about animal objects, of the animals, by, often just putting glass in front of them, you're limited to the visual. So I can so see how when people come into a museum and go, oh, they're so pretty, that is quite an inherent and quite kind of foregrounded response to the objects, because you're kind of pushed to do that. And certainly across the series, I think we saw with the hummingbirds, even with Mudeng, actually, aesthetics used as a kind of excuse to objectify, that the inherent beauty of the animal, or the inherent in Mudeng, maybe not beauty, but cuteness, perhaps. I mean, I think she's beautiful, but, I think that was, was sort of an excuse. And, Edwin Rist also used it as, well, I'd rather have like pretty or interesting, sell them to make pretty or interesting fishing flies rather than their use for science. So I think there is this inherent tension which the museum creates, because of the museum largely being a viewing experience. It's not tactile. It's not, obviously there are audio experiences in museums, but I think we can agree that like the visual is the main thing you're doing when you're viewing museum objects or visiting a museum, that does put this tension between aesthetics and kind of the ethical aspects of the object. And with that, comes this false idea of museums as safe spaces, or museums that inherently kind of hold these objects in this pristine condition, which just isn't true. And which was, not to not to shoehorn in, but it was my favorite episode, like the moths and wasps aspect of like, the preservation is just not something that is stable at all in a museum. It's something that's constantly changing, in which, museum practitioners have to, factor into how they talk about objects, so and how they care for objects.
It makes me think of a recent episode with Kritika Srinivasan on the animal turn, right, where she speaks about these logics of risk and logics of sacrifice and protection. How, like, to protect, often when we speak about protection, there's often someone or something is being sacrificed, right? And this makes me think also of the dodo in particular. To what Rebecca's point here, you really did try to kind of, how much, based on what we currently know about this specific specimen, how much of their life, this dodo's life, this individual's life, can I understand or get to? And that proved to be quite difficult. And also that story changed as new knowledge came into focus. There was this idea, well, they're running out. That's where their value came in. Unlike the hummingbirds and the huia, who were valued, I think, because they're beautiful, or the parrots because their feathers were beautiful. The dodo was almost valued because it was special, because it was running out. And yeah, the wasp episode, I think, speaks to that you do create, and it's not to say that we shouldn't try to preserve things. Like, I think it's hard because when we criticize preservation, is that to say that we shouldn't preserve? And maybe this is a legitimate question. Like, maybe this desire to hold on to things forever is problematic. Even if we like, and I love archives, I love looking at historical documents, but what is this obsession with keeping, right?
One of the things I really, and like this is broader beyond kind of animal objects, but I think it's something that I think about a lot, and it kind of comes up in lots of different places, is the idea of care as a concept, I think, comes up. Because in museums, I think we're seeing a shift slightly from thinking about conservation as something that stasis is something is towards always, keeping the object as it is, towards a more complex idea, which is one of care, because care doesn't have to be about preservation behind glass. Care can also be burning an object if it's sacred to someone and they want it to be burned. It can be about returning an object to a community. It can be about, when we were thinking about bird skins, care there is caring for the bodies in a way that will allow future scientists to make new discoveries, and also care for those past lives of the birds by acknowledging them. Like, I find that a really powerful concept. And it came up again in the parrots episode as well, of, the idea of violent care, that you can really love a bird and keep it in your community, but also cause it pain by plucking its feathers. That it's quite an ethically complex term, but I find it a lot more useful than the idea of conservation or preservation, because I think it allows us to move away from the museum of stasis, because that just isn't the case with objects. And I think allows us to bring in a lot more different perspectives of how we look after objects. And, like, this is a slight sideline, but I think it is relevant that also it affects how then communities who have produced those objects also interact with them. So, like, with the featherworks I work on, for example, feathers are really interesting because they're keratinous materials and they're very delicate. So they tend to be some of the most vulnerable objects in the museum. You have to handle them really carefully. And in the past, kind of past conservation practices have meant that they're now covered in mercury or awful kind of carcinogenic substances, which means that my experience of handling them, and also, we brought over this amazing artist called Cília Tupanamba, who came and looked at Brazilian objects, and they were objects made by her community. As she wasn't able to touch them, she had to wear gloves and a mask, and that really affected her way of interacting with them and her connection to the birds that they were made from, because these past practices of conservation had changed how the objects, could be interacted with. So I think care is a really interesting one that allows us to move away from this idea of the museum as space, and instead think about it a lot more complexly, and hopefully move towards more interesting solutions, like, parasitic wasps to do your pest control rather than carcinogenic materials, which not only suffer the objects, but also mean that our interactions with them as, people that care about them are limited in some ways. So I think, that I think I find a really powerful idea, and I think can be transferred into a lot of different contexts as a kind of ethical framework for understanding our interactions with both the animals and the objects themselves.
All right, so key themes that have emerged from your season so far are, we're looking at ethics, I think ethics and power, and how they change with regards to how objects are collected and how they're observed. The connection between, and I think this also speaks to relationships of Indigenous relations with these objects and how they change. We've also spoken about museums as spaces and what role and function they do, whether that's as preservation, how they prime people to think or not to think about animals. So the role of, I guess, museums and collections. So that was a key theme, the role of museums and collections, the ethics of collecting and showing and keeping and preserving. Then, I'm trying to think of other themes here. I think death is obviously a key theme for me that emerged throughout the season, as well as time, the relationship of time to time and meaning, and how that's also tied to various economies, fashion economies, also museums at the time, menageries, etc. How they, I guess, the idea of beauty doesn't exist in isolation of the kind of economies and practices of the time.
I also found I found the theme of which we talked about earlier in this discussion as well. The theme of like alternative epistemologies, almost. How we kind of see museums as a way to preserve scientific knowledge and like, well, we know everything. We as humankind are enlightened and we discovered everything. But in your season, you keep pointing out how indigenous communities do things so differently from which we can now learn as well. And I think you did a great job of questioning the epistemology of a museum.
What about some tensions that emerged between Rose's different episodes, right? So we've got these kind of key themes that have come up in the season. And I think we've touched on some of these. So, just to go over the episodes, we had the why, then the hummingbird, then the parrots and frogs, which I think there you spoke about multi-species assemblages, which I think is also important. Very rarely are these objects a single animal or a single practice. They're often an assemblage of sorts. The Oxford dodo, I think how some animals become charismatic objects, right? How they become privileged objects as well. The feather heist, I think how stories and the Feather Heist has almost gathered its own kind of narrative and story. I know it's been covered in other podcasts. It's become this kind of sensational story in and of its own right. And then, of course, Mooding, kind of the thinking of contemporary collections. What for you were perhaps some things that were missing or that you would have liked to have seen more of in speaking about these kinds of, this kind of conversation about animals and museum collections or objects?
I think maybe slightly from a content perspective, I think I slightly stayed in my lane of focusing on birds because that was kind of where I was. But I think it would have been interesting to maybe think more about the specific materiality of different objects. And, because one of the things I think about with feathers a lot is that they're slightly different from, say, bones or teeth. There's a slight almost distance from a body from feathers that I don't think I picked into as much as I could have done. And I think the very kind of materiality of the objects, I think we could have spent a bit more time on. And yeah, maybe, doing a bit more of a different breadth of, I think the Pit Rivers was a nice kind of grounding factor, but it might have been interesting to think about different museum spaces a bit more. I would have liked to have explored.
God, there's so much to do. Like I think you've probably inspired some theses and ideas, I think, with this season and many seasons to come.
What I just loved about this season is how it started so delineated and you kind of went with it. It was very obvious as you listen through the episodes that you're broadening your horizon of what this season would be. Starting with bird feathers or huya feathers, and then ending with Mudeng, who is not in a museum and is not a bird. And so I was also very curious that I wrote that down as a question as well, where you could take this. And I guess you could take it anywhere as you've proven, because we've gone from murder mysteries to zoo conservation to fashion. Not really a question, just really impressed.
Yeah, along Harris' point, I guess I was surprised as the season progressed in the topics that you covered, because we started with objects and then we expanded to, here's these moths in the museum that show that, museums are not sterile, just controlled environments. It's actually an ecology that may be sometimes out of human control. And then going on to Mudang, who is definitely not a bird. It would have been interesting, I guess, pointing to the content you were talking about, Rosa, to have some in-between content where, I guess, yes, you were focused on feather because you're interested in its materialities. And I, as an urban birder, I've never really thought about how birds appear in these spaces, or I guess I maybe before have shied away from even putting myself in those spaces because I want to see birds alive and see them in their natural environments. But I think the tension, I guess, for me the whole time was the tension between marveling and extraction, because you were also pointing to that through the stories that you were telling through the birds. There's extraction through colonialism and just science, in the fashion as well, of course. I guess there was a tension, or I guess a difficulty with trying to remain neutral in discussing all of this, while also acknowledging that, yeah, there's a tremendous amount of wrong that was done to animals throughout how they got to the museum, the processes. So, yeah, I think maybe if there was some more exploration about that topic, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I almost think the liveliness came as both of you were speaking here. Like your episodes got more lively as you moved on. I think there was a start with an object, and I think as you focused on animals, the liveliness. There was an active move to move away from objectification. Even though you were looking at objects, I feel as though this tension was also actively trying to see, like, how do I see beyond the object? Because objectification is really powerful, right? Once you're told this is an object and this is what this object does. I mean, there were artists, I don't know artist things, but they would put like a toilet seat on a wall, and by putting an object in a different space it changes its meaning, right? And I think resisting the kind of stories we've been told about specific objects is hard. And as Hera and Rebecca have said, yeah, your movement through the season was almost a subtle resistance to this objectification, and a kind of exploration of liveliness, that we can have conversations about liveliness, um, and we should have conversations about this liveliness and not kind of get too blinkered by the object itself, right?
Definitely, yeah. I think, yeah, in my mind, and I think it kind of comes through, I think possibly like in the introduction of each episode, I think I kind of almost justify myself against the previous episode of saying, well, in the previous episode we did this, but now I want to do this. I think it was really fun to have that kind of organic progression, which, as you say, I think really did move towards getting back to living animals, because, as we kind of started the discussion with, like, looking at a drawer full of dead birds is actually really quite a difficult experience when you know the living thing. And certainly, I think playing with this idea of biography, because I think in the museum world, we have this idea of object biography, which is tracing the life of an object that moves from its, where it's made into the museum and its kind of afterlife. But then you also have the individual animal biography that is intertwined with that, and its afterlife once it's died and kind of become an animal object, that I think was a real kind of tension point throughout, of trying to untangle all of that, and also then think about the individual versus the species in that way as well, which I think was also quite a central theme of, particularly in Mudeng, I think that came out the strongest, was that you are talking about individual animals and individual lives that they have to experience in their own way. And it's not just an animal representative or a pygmy hippo. It is a single animal that has that experience. And even if the animal is dead, I think the individual body still remains important. And I think, yeah, that really kind of came back to me a lot more as I moved through the season.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And again, when you open up that drawer of African greys, each of those African greys had a life, right? Like, it's easy to kind of objectify them as a collection and to think that they had a life and a series of experiences that brought them to being in this drawer, and they experienced those experiences, right? I think so often with history, we tend to just kind of say, and then they were killed, but no, what does it mean to be killed or to be transported or to be collected? For some, this entailed being killed in their homelands. For others, it involved long torments of being shipped and then kept alive and then killed, or dying and pulling apart these threads is perhaps beyond your role as someone who's looking at museum collections, but is certainly a baton that I think people interested in animal histories and animal economies should be asking, and animal representation, right? Like, these are not just objects. And that for me would be, I think, the key takeaway is it's not, when you see something in a museum, particularly something that involves a life, it's really important to remember that it's not just an object. There is a story there, and it's a story worth telling because it was a story that was experienced, right?
I mean, it's a great season. It's made me worried about conservation a lot, I think, which is so funny. Going into it, I didn't expect that to be my main concern. Especially the Mooding episode, actually, like the conclusion that zoos present themselves as conservation places, but that even those are limited, even when they have a Mooding. And if even alive collections or living collections, sorry, aren't really great at doing conservation, then, that begs the question, what role do museums play in there? And especially if, the moths episode kind of did make me anxious about the inevitable passing of time and decay of everything in the end.
Oh, you've tied a bow back to your season on waste, because
Oh, there we go.
there is waste. We can't avoid waste, but we can think more about how waste is created.
Yeah.
And actually, this won't be today when this is released, but I just released a blog post on the Animal Turn's website today, because just recently in a zoo in Germany, 12 baboons were killed, and it was precisely for this, they're part of conservation efforts, and they're part of baboons that are on the red list in West Africa, but they're still being killed in zoos because zoos can't manage the size of the populations. And again, like there's a lot of politics that comes into play in these different spaces, but it comes into play in different ways, right? The zoos, there's contemporary politics and economics at play, and museums are also telling a story. Anything that has a historical angle is often trying to tell a historical story through the lens of today's politics and today's economics, right? And I think the fact that we're having this conversation about animals and animals' lives is partly testament to the fact that animal studies scholars and activists have made animals' lives more present in these spaces. Okay, folks, I'm going to start wrapping up. Why don't we first hear a little bit about Hera and Rebecca, what you're currently working on, and then Rosa will finish with you, and you can give us a kind of final status update on what your project looks like and where you're hoping to take things from here. So Hera, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I am doing some work for the Animal Turn, actually. I'm trying to produce some content in forms of blogs and some videos, so you'll be hearing from me there still. And apart from that, I have finished my PhD.
Yay, Dr. Hera!
And am now going to start in September, by which this will probably be out. I will be starting as a postdoc in Amsterdam on the A.P.P.L.E project, trying to look at police
Yay!
dogs.
Police
Very
dogs.
big yay indeed.
hmm This project's looking at both dogs and rats, but you're focusing on dogs in particular?
Exactly, yeah, and how they relate to urban safety, basically. So, like, how do police dogs ensure or endanger urban populations, and especially like how that differs per population and area?
I will say, I just finished reading this book, The Lion's Historian by Sandra Swart. I'm going to have her on the show hopefully before the end of the year, but she's got a chapter in there about police dogs and the making of police dogs in apartheid South Africa, which I think would be very interesting for your purposes. Congratulations on the PhD and on the postdoc, Hera. Rebecca, how about you?
I am also still working on, or with you, Claudia, on Animal Turn and Animal Highlight episodes. So my season, Animals in Design, will be forthcoming. With some of the things I've been working on with the rest of the Animal Turn and Animal Highlights, that kind of got, moved around, but it will be coming, I promise everyone.
We're working on so
Yeah.
much behind the scenes. Rebecca is working on like a bazillion
Yeah.
things behind the scenes for
Yes.
the
And then another
podcast.
thing that you mentioned as well was the paper we're working on speculation. So, it's kind of interesting how it also relates to Rosa's season in some way, but, you're bringing the archival and past side of cows, and then I'm speculating on the future of cows. So we're kind of bringing that together, trying to synthesize and tease out the tensions.
I will say we were talking about that before I clicked record, so the listeners might not know what we're talking about. But Rebecca and I are we're writing a book chapter together about speculation. Yeah, and as Rebecca said, I'm looking at the history of cows, and she's looking at the potential future of cows in North America, and it's been really fun to develop. Right?
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I forgot we discussed before we clicked record. And then other than that, I'm just still practicing as a landscape architect.
And you also, I mean, the animals and media season will be coming out soon. And I know you worked together with them on the Mars test, which is a test designed at looking at media and animals. And you helped with some of the artwork there, which is really, I mean, I've seen some of it and it's beautiful. So that'll be all coming out. And once it does, we'll let the listeners know. So congrats, Rebecca, on all you're doing and your incredible art and ideas and designs. We're happy and delighted to have you on the team. You are busy finishing up your PhD, right?
I am, yeah. Yeah, slowly but surely. It'll get there. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, all of you, for engaging so nicely with this season, because it has taken a while to get there. And yeah, Claudia, it's been such a nice experience of working on this. And yeah, as I said, like the lens of doing the podcast has been really helpful. And I think be part of my thesis, which is a really nice thing because it's a practice-based thesis. Any of this should hopefully be able to be included. So that's really exciting. But yeah, no, thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been great working with you. And yes, it has taken, I think something I've learned from working with all three of you is when I originally started the Fellows program, I was like, 6 months should be enough time to kind of get a season of animal highlights. But that doesn't really account for life, one, and two, how I think difficult it is to actually write these highlights. For people listening, you might think, it's just 5 to 10 minutes of, listening to interesting content, but it actually requires a great deal of thought, and positioning animals as the subjects for working with several fellows now has been the most difficult thing that everyone has done, is how to write in a way that actually takes animals seriously is hard. It's not an easy task. But you've all done really well. And I know Rebecca's got several seasons that I've also seen behind the scenes, and it's just so enjoyable for me to work with people like you and learn from folks like you. So thank you so much for joining me as fellows, for giving of your time and your ideas, and hopefully we'll develop more in future together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and Rosa.
Absolutely.
And Herre.
Thank you so much, Rosa Dyer, for joining us again on the Animal Highlight to discuss some of your ideas. Thank you to Herre de Bondt and Rebecca Shen for also joining us and helping us to flesh out those ideas a bit more. It was a really wonderful conversation. And Rosa, I enjoyed working with you over the course of this season. So thank you, thank you, thank you. The logo was designed by Rebecca Shen, and all episode artwork has been done by her as well. And the bed music, which should be familiar to you both here on the Animal Highlight and the Animal Tone, is done by Gordon Clarke. This episode was produced by myself. This is the Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.